Computer. Okay, here we go. We're on. So
We're on.
My name is Jillian. I'm going to do a little introduction here. This is the maiden voyage of Off the Rails podcast. I have my lovely friend Scot Kyle here with me. I'm going to do an introduction for Scott in a minute, but first I'm going to introduce myself, what's happening here, and why we're here. So yes, as I said, this is the maiden voyage, the first podcast off the rails. And my intention with this podcast is for it to be a space to share ideas, have conversations about all things that are sort of affecting us as mortals in our mortal journey on the planet and in this realm, right? Spirituality, politics, philosophy, health, child rearing, and maybe some conspiracies too, right? That might be, it may or may not be heavily laden with conspiracy theories. And, that's a loaded word. And I say that in quotations for many different reasons. And I'm sure we'll get into that along the way. So that's sort of my quick little introduction there. The crazy train has launched. Now, I've invited Scott here because, well, first of all, Scott has been, if I may sort of put it this way, one of my biggest cheerleaders, and also very much a mentor of sorts. And so I really honor your presence, and thank you for that, and thank you for your time and the energy that it takes to be here. So there's that. Now Scott, medicine man, shaman, very, very much a teacher and a wisdom seeker and a wisdom giver, I think, too. Educator as well, a formal educator, a previous formal educator, but so many things. I want to introduce you, all the things about you. I'll let you also take the reins for a minute, but you might also know Scott as Wile E. Coyote on CILU 102.7 FM on Friday afternoons from 1 to 3. You're doing the Paradigm Shift Cafe. That's a big part of your gifts to the world too, where there are so many issues and topics that you tackle there in such a beautiful way. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you, Jillian. Thank you for all of that. Yes. Thank you for your accolades and the introduction, and for launching this podcast off the rails. You and I have talked about, well, it's kind of a reciprocation at this point. And again, thank you for all that introduction, most of which I probably don't deserve, but you and I go back a ways now, and this is kind of a reciprocation, and I'm glad you're doing this online effort as well. So thank you for your time and energy back at you. You've been on my radio show, the Paradigm Shift Cafe. I'm a local boy, Thunder Bay, sort of born and bred, actually born in small town Fort Frances west of here, pulp and paper town as well, and grew up in Current River. I have two siblings, typical sort of 50s family that my parents had. We're all spaced out by sort of 2 years. I'm the middle child, younger sister, older brother. And that said, I loved growing up in Thunder Bay. I still love residing in Thunder Bay. I think it's a very, very powerful place on the geographical map of the world. And I've called the boreal north of Superior region, the Cambrian Shield, boreal forest. I've called it many times. I've referred to it as an oasis on the planet. It has a power. It has a geological, and dare I say, of course, a spiritual power, because that's where most of my, if all musical roads, speaking of my radio show, if all musical roads lead to jazz, all roads probably lead to spiritual considerations. And that was the thrust of back in 2005 when I was educated, my first 3 years of post-secondary education were at Lakehead University. And then I took a year off and worked in the woodworking business. And then I went off to do my 4th year at Queen's University in philosophy. And then when I realized what I'd done there, I went off and got a teacher's degree to try and be useful to the world, because they're not hiring philosophers out there. And so anyway, so that said, that's sort of a little bit of the broad strokes of my background. As I say, I love the Thunder Bay region. We call ourselves a city, but we're really 2 small towns, sort of pasted together with all of our rivalries. And if you look at historic rivalries between Port Arthur and Fort William, the north and the south wards of Thunder Bay, there are many sort of legendary stories about how people were divided politically, socially, and so on, and even
economically, right? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and if you look at some of that, I saw that actually those old days. No matter how far back you go, I always saw that as a sort of what I would call a friendly rivalry that resulted in many interesting developments on each side of the city. That the kind of friendly competition. Okay, so that said as well, we're at the Lakehead. We've also always had the nickname of the Lakehead because we're at the apex. Nipigon proper is at the actual apex of the lake, but we're sort of there. We're on the biggest bay of Lake Superior, and of course we're on the mother Lake Superior, which is where a lot of our power and energy comes from too. So those are the real positive things about where we reside, and of course there are many other positive things too about humanity moving forward and where we're at. So I'm looking forward to the conversation with you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks for that. Yeah. It's a special place. There's people I've heard call it a vortex. And I mean, we have all this crystal here. We have all the, we have the silver mine. So we have a major amount of like these precious metals that are energetical vortexes, as well as the crystals that are energetical vortices, I guess. And, that vortex could go either way. I mean, that vortex can be a manifestation for positive high vibrations, or the other way. And so, lots of different experiences here. But yeah.
And on that note, Jill, if I may, again, energy, human energy, earth telluric energy, the energy of the earth herself. We have nothing but rivers and lakes up here. Mm-hmm. If you look at the Quetico region just west of here, it's as much water as it is land. Mm-hmm. So we have that, and as you say, you mentioned the minerals and water. Mm-hmm. So and then the vortex of energy that you're referring to, and sort of implying some things there. Of course, all of our fire type energy is related to electrical and now electronics. Mm-hmm. And so we have our finger on the pulse of great energy here, and what way those vortices go is largely really up to the human mind and human consciousness, and we funnel a lot of our electric and electronic energy into the internet, mm-hmm. and that would be I wonder, maybe part of our conversation. What?
Well, absolutely. Let me just let me just jump on that. So mm-hmm. our body has an electrical charge, right? Everything has an electrical charge and an electrical vibration. We're a walking EMF. We have EMFs in our body, right? But there are different there are different I don't want to use the term vibrations, frequencies. There we go. There are different frequencies which are running through different, let's say, electromagnetic fields. So our electromagnetic field in our body has a frequency. The electromagnetic field of the 5G tower has a frequency. The electromagnetic of the EMF running through the router in our home has a frequency. The television has a frequency, right? The grounding into the earth's magnetic charge has a frequency, right? We're talking about magnetic, electromagnetic, And yeah, and I think that exactly depending on, let's say the air pressure or the weather and the sort of how that corresponds with the electromagnetic charge of the earth and the metals and the crystals that are in it, combined with the state of mind or the sort of vibration we're carrying around energetically, it's all connected, and it can be amped or sort of dampened down depending on, tons of different factors. And yeah, to get into the idea that we're using electronics constantly, I relate a lot of things, and I know it's a bit cheesy, but I relate a lot of things back to that Jeff Goldblum quote in Jurassic Park, which was, we were so busy trying to figure out if we could, we didn't stop to think if we should. And I think that is sort of humanity's, like, or industrial man, if you will, industrial man's maybe downfall, yeah, I think that might be industrial man's downfall, is sort of that idea that we have these beautiful brains, but did we stop to think if we should employ that direction, right? Or employ that energy in that direction. So yeah, we use electronics. I don't think we think much about it anymore, at least to a large extent. Like, I think about it, and I know you think about it, but I think that even you and I, for that matter, I mean, we're on an electronic device right now doing this meeting, and it's a thing. It's not nothing.
It's not nothing. That's a good Jillian phrase there.
Yeah.
We of course you're right to touch on these things. We you mentioned about the just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. Jurassic Park kind of line, but and of course that statement is predated by the Old Testament thing. You can have everything in the garden, but the tree of the knowledge of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And it's an ambiguous, not to get all biblical here, but it's an ambiguous teaching that perhaps a lot of Christians haven't even examined or understood. But it's really just that what you pointed to, which is just because we can eat or partake of something and harvest or exploit something, it doesn't mean that we should. And of course, yeah, go ahead.
Well, and isn't that the nature of freedom itself, in a way?
Yeah.
The idea that, we may have the freedom to do this or that. It doesn't always mean that we need to employ it, or we need to take advantage of it. I mean, there's also discernment. There's also careful mindfulness and awareness of, the needs of, others, the needs of the planet, the needs of the animals, the needs of the non-human people surrounding us, the needs of, everything that works together in this symbiotic relationship in the realm that we're in, to kind of provide us with life and sustenance as we know it, right? I think that is sort of the human condition, is sort of like being able to understand that. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really, really crucial thing to think about, is the idea that, just because we can doesn't mean we should. But also that, it ties into the idea that I think it's important that we have the freedom to do it if we need to, or if we want to. But it doesn't always mean that that's what we need to do, right?
It's been said that in some of my readings and teachings that I harvest, if you will, get interested in, it's been said that if God is love, and that is the highest frequency of consciousness, which is part of my belief system, then God's next most important value is freedom. So God, in a sense, God loved us enough to grant us freedom, and it wasn't even something that even God could give or grant. It's inherently part of us. If we see ourselves in some kind of relationship with a creator, a great spirit, and so on. that freedom is very much a part of love, and that but then with freedom, of course, comes the great cosmic spiritual equation. With freedom should and must come some kind of responsibility, which is what we seem to be learning down here.
Absolutely. So one of the things that I like that you touched on some of the teachings, because I am really hoping that you might talk a little bit about some of the teachings you've been exploring, the gnosis, if you will, the knowledge that you've been exploring in the last few years, which goes by the name of the new message. And I was hoping that you touch on that a little bit, because it's part of what I've been drawn into through your gracious teachings as well. So I'd love for you to go into that a bit.
Well, again, and thanks for calling them, my teachings. Of course, real teachings are not owned by anybody, of course, right? We know this wisdom, and you and I have intersected in what I call a wisdom circle. And it's really just it's not about creating any central gurus, as I hope you're aware of. It was about gathering small groups of people in this wisdom circle where you and I intersected, and to talk about just what we're doing here, talk about the times we're in, how humanity may or may not be changing and shifting, and again, back, name my radio show The Paradigm Shift, and so on. And just to really explore some stuff and give people a chance to open up a few topics, and then give people a chance to respond. So we'll get to the latest sort of chapter of my spiritual development, which is the newmessage.org. I've got this T-shirt that talks about that. But I encourage people to, if they listen to this, they might want to check it out. It's newmessage.org, www.newmessage.org. But a little bit of a lead up to that, because I feel that I've reached almost like a peak or an apex in my spiritual learning. So just the broad strokes of some of the things that led me up to it. As I mentioned, I started in philosophy. I'm always interested as much in the question or a question as I am in arriving at some kind of destination or an answer. Because as soon as we arrive at an answer, we sort of plateau our learning, right? We say, "Oh, I got it all happening here now, and I've decided the way it is and the way it is." Many of the other area. I mean, I was raised, Protestant United Christian, very very benign branch of Christianity. So that the Sunday school with Jesus stuff was there as a foundation, and then you rebel against that in your teens, and you find stuff at university that interests you, and then I kind of went from philosophy into what we might call spirituality, and I did study religions of the world, but it went into Eastern religions, Hinduism and Buddhism. Because I found a refreshing departure from a sort of Western lens on things, and there's interesting crossovers there for sure. And then I discovered some material by American journalist Neil Donald Walsh called "Conversations with God," and essentially in the midst of the depression that came after 5 marriages, all of which he produced children in, didn't feel he could support them. He was virtually living on the street, collecting aluminum cans to cash them in to get enough money to make a phone call to apply for a job, type of situation. And he received a communication from the divine, some people call it channeling, 11 books, and literally a conversation with God. Now, the cynics will say, well, oh yeah, he's really full of himself. This is all right, and they may either be lacking in faith or they may be just too cynical. But I would only say the proof is in the pudding. Have a look at the material. If it resonates for you, then it may help you grow. That's as simple as it is for me. So it's never about sort of evangelizing, right? And then also in the midst of that, I was really informed with and interested in Jiddu Krishnamurti's teachings, worldwide global spiritual teacher as well, out of India. and also the Course in Miracles, which Marianne Williamson has been a real harbinger of online and so on. And Course in Miracles is purportedly a communication of Holy Spirit, Christ, Holy Spirit material. So now fast forward to the past, I'd say 10, 11 years, I have been ensconced in, immersed in studying a vast quantity of material. It's now 9,000 pages in length, and they're still trying to keep up with their budget for even publishing stuff that hasn't been published yet. And they being the Society for the New Message that I just mentioned. And it's a phenomenon that people would be wise to be open to, that began occurring through one individual man, an American man in Colorado, when he was sort of in the wake of or right around the time of a job turning point for him. He was a teacher. He was a teacher of blind youth, literally a teacher of the blind, and he began to. He was sort of struggling to develop a curriculum for these young blind folks, and then he began to. He was spending some time in the American Southwest in the desert. He began to receive what Neil Walsh in Conversations with God said, that it kind of feels like a whispering in your head, you know. And many people, sometimes we call that mental illness, right? Schizophrenia and so on. And then there are really bright, genius people who sort of get a pen out and start recording this stuff, and then we can see if it's got some substance. So without going into too much of the details of the actual phenomenon, he began to receive what is now called and collected into one book called a body of teachings called The Steps to Knowledge. And it was very perplexing to him too at the time. And he was like, he didn't even think of it as a writing or something that needed to be published. But long story short, it became basically 1 page a day. He received it over a period of about 12 weeks. And there are 365 steps. So for any student who's interested in expanding her or his spiritual base, spiritual knowledge, this is amazing material. And you have 1 page to read per day, and you turn to the next page the next day. And it teachings on everything from the threshold that humanity is going through right now, kind of pointing us in a direction, and and pointing out to us that God can and will communicate to humanity again, and teachings around everything from human sexuality to forgiveness to anger, all the cornerstones of the things that we struggle, some of us struggle with, right? So it just to pause and give the broader strokes, and for me personally, it of course really resonated because I became a student of the material. And I went down and visited this man, Marshall Vian Summers is his name, Marshall Summers. He's married, been married quite a number of years. He has a wife and 1 son. And they both assist him in disseminating and publishing the material. His son is very gifted with electronics and web design. And so he brought his son formally into the whole thing and said, yeah, I need your help. And so now they have yearly or every second or third year, they run what they call encampments just above Boulder, Colorado, at a place called Estes Park. It's an old YMCA location, beautiful location. And they gather, last time I was there a few years back, there were 200 people at the encampment. And, they use electronic screen to put up some of the revelations, and we talk about stuff, and you get to meet the messenger, get to hear him speak. And I'll just leave off at this point for this moment and say that the new message, it comes with its own commentary upon itself. And it's coming from, purportedly, it's coming from the what's called the Angelic Assembly, which is a group of minds who are in non-physical form, who are kind of like a spiritual atmosphere around the planet. And they guide all of us. if we're open to it. And there are angelic assemblies around all planets where there are where intelligent life resides. So there's lots of material in here about what the new message calls the threshold that humanity is actually and indeed going through.
Wow. Yeah, it's really beautiful. And, I can attest to just having, been privy to like only a few of the teachings, but, or a few messages, a few individual messages, but it's quite
Right.
profound. And there's definitely, it definitely resonates if you're somebody who kind of forays into the realms of the understanding that, I guess for lack of a better terminology, that, we're not alone. And and yeah, maybe we could just leave that part of it there. Because, like, I think there's some people that are ready to hear some things, and there might be people who aren't. And it's not about, oh, you're not ready or you're not evolved enough or
No,
something like that.
no.
It's just about, there's some people who are ready and are willing to hear certain certain things, and there are other people who aren't. And I get that, even, there was a time in my life where I probably wouldn't have been ready to receive any of that. And because it can be scary. It can be scary to hear some of it. And it can, I mean, as
Oh,
beautiful and comforting as the messages are, like, there's nothing scary
oh,
about them. But I mean, even just the idea that, maybe there are beings, entities, as you said, non-physical beings, non-human, Gnostics, hanging around, that may have some information that would be beneficial to us.
right.
Even that, the idea of that is something that, I think can be a scary or really foreign.
Well,
Idea.
Jill, I mean, on that,
Mhm.
one of the teachings from the new message and is that humanity is being induced. And that is the word. Sometimes they use the word induced more often and sometimes even seduced
Mhm.
in a direction.
Mhm.
So that you're right. There are entities. There is a mental environment, and whether you call them angels or other beings
Mhm.
in a physical or non-physical form. One of the concepts that gets talked about greatly throughout the entire new message is that humanity is already in a greater, it resides within a greater community of intelligent life within the universe.
Mhm.
The greater community, it's referred to as, in other words, life in the universe. In fact, there's one whole book of Revelations called Life in the Universe.
Well, and may I add, what we would probably commonly, sort of lay personally refer to as extraterrestrial.
And in fact, they use the term, the new message uses the term to, when I say they, the angelic assembly. They use the term
Extraterrestrial,
ET.
super terrestrial, supraterrestrial, right? Because it's not necessarily just terrestrial in the physical sense, it's terrestrial in the energetical sense. And when you said mental, it encompasses the mental, the physical, and the supra physical, like
Supra.
yeah. Well, yeah, the metaphysical. Yeah, there you go.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's reminding us, the new message is reminding us that some of the perplexing so-called Stone Age developments on the planet that still are here, like the Sphinx and the pyramids and the Machu Picchu and Easter Island and the Stonehenge, these phenomenal, and the carvings at Petra, and throughout Egypt and Turkey, and these things are being unearthed now, and Graham Hancock is getting into it, and Joe Rogan has had him on, and it's very perplexing because some of us are questioning even the science and the chronology and archaeology around these things, And the new message is very curt and precise about it, and said, well, of course there were civilizations here, and they're not always humanoid, and that humans may have been residing in parallel with it, and in fact we still are. Mm-hmm. And that we have to. The new message is clear in saying that it's human ignorance. This is there are so many phrases that you can easily spin out if you're a student of the material. The new message is it's human ignorance and arrogance, fundamentally and consistently, that always assumes that it's the center of the universe. You know,
and right? I wonder if it makes me, curious if it's human arrogance and or ignorance that perhaps, now this is just I'm just spinning off here and speculating, but that perhaps created the conditions for these entities or these beings to say, okay, we're either going to we're going to transfer ourselves into, or transmute ourselves into non-physical form, if you will, or just get the fuck out of Dodge completely, because we've joked around a few times about Earth being the hillbilly planet. Like, okay guys, we got to get out of here, it's getting hairy, you know what I'm saying? And not to offend any hillbillies who may be listening. Much respect to some hillbillies.
Yeah, we wouldn't want to offend the hillbillies.
Well,
they're pretty wise people if you look at the Appalachians.
Well, there's some, there's wisdom to be had there for sure. But yeah, so I wonder about that. I wonder if, in their infinite wisdom, if they kind of read the room a bit, if you will, and we're like, okay, we see where this is going.
Yeah, and yet, and the thing is, do we see where it's going?
Yeah.
And reading the room, yeah. I mean, and they're still they never got out of Dodge. I love your colloquialisms, but they never got out of Dodge. They're still very much here. Yeah. And in fact, what's happening? See, I would throw out to any challenge that came my way about this sort of phenomenon, and I would say, okay, I would meet the challenge in the about authenticity of it, and this could be bunk, and by saying, look at it, but also okay, I've written a small blog piece on this, entitled Revelations, you say. In other words, okay, I will answer the challenge by saying, okay, what would be revelatory about this? How would you litmus paper this being revelatory? Okay, Scott, why do you call this revelatory? Give me something profound. Well, I'd be glad to spend a couple hours with you, because the greater community, the so-called greater community, in other words, beings that are non-human, are still here in our midst. And in fact, what's happening, and has been happening since roughly the 1950s, is their involvement in humanity is being wrapped up. And it's a very, very practical and down-to-earth reason why. The reason is that we as a species on a planet have reached a point of development. We have a global communication system. It's called the internet. It was television and radio for a while. Now it's the internet. We have a global transportation system. We are developing, like the UN and the EU, you may or may not, to whatever extent, it's a global governance system that is emerging. So all these things are germinating and developing into a threshold for humanity, and now we are ripe for insertion of other communities into our very culture, and it's happening right under our noses.
Infiltration, yeah, we're ripe for infiltration, right?
And inducement. Mm-hmm. We're being induced. Mm-hmm. And there, I could give examples about that, but it would sound like it's tainted by my perspective.
Right.
So my opinions are definitely being informed by and enlightened by the new message. But we are ripe and ready and for greater manipulation in what the new message in Marshall Summers calls the mental environment. You only need to look at our global media, which is like fact, not conspiracy, corporate owned. So therefore, to see and gauge whether or not you feel you're being manipulated.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I really appreciate the synopsis and it's a, the new message. Yeah. I mean, this is kind of an area, I mean, not just the new message, but
Right.
some of these, sort of esoteric, spiritual,
Right.
metaphysical ideas and conversations is, as you mentioned earlier, is definitely an area that we've sort of converged, and we could spend a long time delving into, and we often do, right? But to kind of, maybe we could segue a little bit into
Sure.
that idea that, the idea that you just mentioned about the media.
Well,
About the,
can I will touch on something then,
yes,
because
please.
it's very current, because just in the past couple of days, I heard, I'll give you an example
Yeah.
of something that's just news and has been news for 10, 15 years, and it keeps coming up.
Mm.
They found some ancient fossilized microbes in an outback area of Australia,
Mm.
just very, very recently, and it was in the news the last couple of days,
Mm-hmm.
our national CBC.
Mm-hmm.
And I love all things about the earth, and I love archaeology and anthropology and geology. And they said, well, but isn't it interesting that they found almost an almost identical structure of what may be fossilized microbial life forms on ancient Earth, but almost identical to the crater and the delta which flows into the crater on Mars that they're studying presently.
Mm.
So,
Mm.
and again, what they do is they say things like, well, there's a good chance that we found evidence of water because it's a delta. It's a delta. It fans out like water. There probably was water on Mars, and we're finding microbial evidence. But here's the subtle thing that comes up. This is in mainstream media,
Mm-hmm.
and we're bombarded with this minutia
Mm-hmm.
on what I would call a dumbed down level to keep us focused, like there might be life on another planet. And back to my very recent point here about okay, revelations, you say, Scott. Well, what makes them revelatory? But who's talking about the absolute magnitude of the cosmos? But the new message, for example, Buddhism touches on it for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But not only the magnitude of it, but in the words of the Creator, interpreted through the angelic assembly received by Marshall in the new message from God, they say that more or less, we've got news for you. There are a billion world systems with intelligent species of life in the multiverse, because we're not just talking about one universe. The cosmos is like, I liken it to the petals of a flower overlapping beautifully, and universes are being born as you and I speak.
Mm-hmm.
So again, revelatory, because that just it throws that the media smokescreen in a sense. Now maybe it's actual scientific ignorance. Maybe science. I'm not tossing science out, because science is trying to do, I believe, exactly what we spiritualists and religionists are trying to do too. They're trying to probe into the mystery of what we're going through here. So I don't, far be it from me to criticize science. That's not what this is about, or even media. But we need a quantum leap in our consciousness. And this
So
is an opportunity.
yeah, absolutely. So yes, let me touch on that. So yeah, first of all, anything that is being reported by the media is like, for personally, this is just a personal perspective, but and philosophy, but is just taken with a massive dump of salt over the shoulder.
Right.
It's like,
Right.
okay, yeah, that may be, but I agree with you that, and I'd be hard pressed to think anything other than whatever's being sort of presented to us in the media is designed to get us to look in a certain direction, and away from something else. Like I always kind of
Right.
use the analogy of the Eye of Sauron, and how, they were trying to kind of create a war over here so that Sauron wasn't looking to Mordor, where Sam and Frodo were secretly and, painstakingly trying to bring the ring into Mount Doom, into the fires. So, and I mean,
Wizard of Oz, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain.
that's right. So I'm really, that's really where my sort of train of thought always goes. And I absolutely agree with you that, I mean, it's quite ridiculous at this point that I agree. It's totally ridiculous at this point. I'll finish this thought that, we're sort of looking at something, right, as the minutia of, oh, there may be some similar, some ancient bacterial life that we found on this planet that's close. And it's something that I think they do dumb it down, because it's something that I think that, I don't even want to use the word they, because then you get people, the critics,
Right.
Who are they?
Yeah, no, for sure.
But, dumbing it down for us because it's something tangible. It's something we can think about. It's something very easy to think about over your morning coffee and then forget about when you go to work for the day, right? That like, oh, cool, there's life on Mars. There might be life on Mars, David Bowie. And yeah, and I think that it's like science. I agree with you when you say that science is trying to do, I agree with you that science, actually, it's interesting because science and spirituality and God and religion, people try to separate them all the time. And I don't actually believe they're separate entities at all. And in fact, I do believe that science was trying to, use a system of evidence gathering and observation to draw conclusions. And I believe there is that's a valid tool. That's a valid tool to use in different instances. But I do think that even really very recently, and, arguably the whole time, science has always also been used as a dogmatic, religious cult, to sort of deny and to snuff out anything that, quote unquote, scientists and or science or scientists and or the people funding the science don't want sort of focused on or platformed, such as the notion that perhaps we live in a complex multiverse, and there are, what we would refer to, probably ignorantly as intelligent. I mean, and I say ignorantly because we're using the term intelligent as in direct sort of proportion to our intelligence, which is laughable at best, I would say. Because I think there's a reason that they used to work with us and they don't really make themselves as quite widely known anymore. Get the hell out of here kind of thing. Not quite out of here, but yeah. I hope my little rant made sense. I think
it does. And
yeah.
I'll just circle back a little bit, if I may.
Yeah.
Two things about the media narrative. And again, I'll say a broad stroke thing here for a moment. It's fun. It's interesting. We've been through the pandemic, and you and I won't necessarily sidetrack into that for the moment, but
let's sidetrack into that another time, because let's go right into it one day, because
okay,
we need it. We need to go right into it.
Okay, good. So that was clearly a narrative, and it's funny how even the word narrative, think for a second, how it's charged. If it depends on who's using it, of course. but those of us who are calling out some of the facts and figures that are coming at us these days as a bombardment with great repetition, you have to look to what's being really repeated a lot. And why is it being repeated? And why are we being narrated toward certain truths, small t truths? I'm going to give you a couple of examples. Like you say, look over here and don't look over there. Well, war is a very general example of that. Why do we at this stage of the game, when we are making our first baby steps toward the moon and Mars, and we've got digital wireless communications, we've got some pretty sophisticated technologies. And why are you might say, well, certainly I do. Like, why are we still violent enough that we can drop bombs on another culture? Which is really like dropping bombs on ourselves, because we're going to have to fix all that. But that's a whole other thing, spiritually speaking. And then, so war is a seriously problematic thing, and the new message does deal with that in great length. That we must, the new message, this is something that people won't like spiritually, because the new message uses the word must quite a bit. We must end war. We must restore our atmosphere, our soils, our waters. This is up to us. I'm talking real spiritual, like, this isn't spiritual woo out there stuff. This is like boots on the ground, rubber boots and gloves in the rivers. We've got to clean the planet. And I'm going to do a nasty segue here for a moment, and I'll pass it back to you about, again, this is about the narrative. And this is something I unearthed just to give people, this is planting a seed. What I'm doing here is planting a seed of what if. Here's a real hot news item that everybody knows about. This billionaire and his son went down in the submersible down to the Titanic. And we're supposed to believe, first of all, word for word, even scientists said, okay, first of all, this is facts, that it was a very faulty and low grade submersible. It shouldn't have gone down. They said, okay, certain people, experts said, okay, so that's part of that's subtly part of the narrative. Now, I listen to, I don't think it's gospel, but I listen to Kim Gogwin with Network News, and she, here and there, and with a grain of salt for sure, but she's at least proposed, and again, not all of her stuff resonates for me, but she's proposed that actually this is just a billionaire disappearing himself because he's into trouble with certain areas. You'll never find the minutest body part at that depth of the ocean.
Yeah.
And all they had was fragments.
Well, yeah,
So,
because already the news has come out and said, oh, well, the vessel has imploded and it's gone under that high pressure that just, there's just particles of it everywhere. And yeah, exactly. And at that point, like, they're already talking, I've read like mainstream news articles saying, well, at that pressure level, the vessel would just explode, and if any little leak got in there, the vessel would explode, and surely that's what's happened. And exactly, nice and clean, wrap it up in a little
I'm saying,
box. And
Kim Gogwin aside, I'm just she spurred my
and
thinking.
I mean, she's not the only one, and to be honest,
Okay.
just for the off the rails record, I'm not into her, but I appreciate.
Okay, fair enough. And I'm not. There's some missing parts there, and I'm not
100%.
fully in with her either.
No,
but she's an intelligent woman. Anyway,
fair enough, and that's true for many.
And that's not
true for many. Many people, who may be useful.
No, and that's the Kim Gogwin reference is all me, not off the rails.
That's fine.
Yeah.
And I appreciate it. I know I appreciate it. So I don't, when you bring something like that up, like the idea that it could be a billionaire disappearing himself, I mean, like, there's no argument for me, because like right away that's what people do. And especially if somebody who's high profile, better, the more news it makes, the better, because it's like, oh, that guy died in the crazy, crash. And like, I'm not sure how much difference it makes for the people that are sort of close in that circle, or who may or may not be, looking for him or trying to, right? But what it does do is create
Distraction.
a mainstream narrative, right? And what's the root of the word narrative is to narrate, to tell a story, to create a tale, a story, right? It's a story.
And again, I only mention it to corroborate and agree with what you had just alluded to,
Absolutely.
which is there's a storyline going on.
Yeah.
And
There's always a storyline going on, whether
yeah,
it's, and to get back to what you mentioned about, war, the story, like there's always a story, right? There's always a story. I mean, these
my
people are
story.
propaganda experts, like they're propaganda experts, and the news, the mainstream news as we know it, I don't care if you like what I'm saying, it is true, is propaganda. That's what it is. It is propaganda, and these
And
people
that's
are
why we're having
propaganda
this
experts.
chat. And that's why I honor the fact that you're launching this this first episode of Off the Rails and offering an alternative perspective. Because again, just touch in with the new message for a moment, because the essence of the spiritual message is that the Creator has planted a seed in all of us, in all beings throughout the entire cosmos, the multiverse. When we left home, so to speak, on our journey of creating ourselves, and the Creator's kind of like, well, there was a rebellion. There was a rebellion where certain souls within the realm of creation wanted to leave creation, and God's kind of like, well, this is really awkward because there's nowhere that isn't creation, but I'll create another realm, and this is where it gets kind of serious. I'll create another realm called this, that science calls the space-time continuum, or the realm of physicality, or what the Buddha called samsara, where you can go temporarily for a timeout from creation, and we're going to call it, in the new message, it's called the realm of separation. So it's so beautiful, the realm of creation, which is beyond all thought and analysis. I couldn't explicate it. And then there's the realm of separation that we find ourselves in for whatever inexplicable reason. There's a reason of recreating unity between me and you, man and woman, man and nature, and all of the realms of connection. So recreating unity, but there's also a deeper mystery in you and in me that is your path up this metaphysical mountain.
It's so interesting. The whole concept of the realm of separation is so interesting physically, and in terms of the idea of that. I love how you put it, like it's getting awkward. Now it's awkward.
Yeah.
But it's also interesting conceptually, because we often will find ourselves in this realm that we're in this physicality, this embodiment that we have, this corporeal reality. We find ourselves sort of, in the realm of separation, if you will.
Yet again.
Well, separated, whether it's from our physical environment, the natural world, our people, the closest people to us, our loved ones, there's that whole concept of like the midlife crisis, if you will, finding ourselves in that whole, the sort of ever-present realm of separation. It's really interesting, because it plays out in many different ways in our spiritual as well as physical reality, right?
Yeah,
Wow.
I'll just reframe that a little bit, because that you make a very good point, because we've left, let's say we've left the home of the creation, and we find ourselves, the first tenet of Tibetan Buddhism, there is a problem. What is the problem? Another incarnation.
Yeah.
So, and then as you've just said, there's separation within separation. So now we go into our little houses and cars and jobs and careers and ambitions, and we separate even into genders. And we'll just leave that one alone for now, right? So we've got our little gender camps, and even within an average heterosexual marriage, there's all kinds. You get separated and you get divorced, and you separate again and again and again. We separate into ideology. I don't agree with you, and I'm not going to be friends with you anymore. So yeah, it's problematic because
Well, and as you said right off the hop, it's a false dichotomy, because there is no separation. There is only creation. That is the only thing that exists. There is only one, and there is no separation at all. Which is
wonderful.
why it's so interesting, because I think we've kind of fallen into this, perhaps, intentionally or other. We've fallen into this sort of pattern, being humans, that we sort of fight our whole lives to become separate from whatever the fuck it is, right? And
So we teach, and the ultimate separation is ego itself. This is where Freud was sort of genius, right?
Mhm.
Um, we that's all fine and well, whatever you got going on, but what about me? And we blow, and we teach, particularly in the West, and that's why I was refreshed by Hinduism and Buddhism, because it seemed more inclusive to a wider cosmos, and even culturally.
Indeed.
But in the West, greatly, we teach ego, and we teach everything from different musical tastes to different clothing styles and running shoes and different kinds of cars. If you really penetrate this, it's insidiously very destructive and psychologically damaging. What the damage.
And I think it's really easy too to see it, like if you want to see, if you're open to it, I think it's really easy to see how it is orchestrated in a direction. It is
In a
sort of
narrative.
orchestrated to sort of orient us towards separation, consumerism, destructive and damaging disaster capitalism, this
Right?
war. But I think it all really, really we could say that it all is rooted in the notion of the me versus you, and that's separate, the idea of the separateness, of the ego, of the me, of the you, of the idea that there's even a difference, or yeah.
So I look to things now. Well, again, on the pot, it's interesting that that we've used the word narrative, and it's mostly a word. When you use the word narrative, somebody is othering somebody else, because if you and I use the word narrative, we're talking about the storyline that we find is fairly obviously being presented in the media. And there are flavors of the day, of the week, of the month, right? Like now we've got the war in Ukraine, and we won't touch that for the moment, but it is a narrative, and we're supposed to pick. And the broad strokes are, we're supposed to pick a side. And I'm like, what if? I mean, we said in the '60s we were against putting communism down by war, with the Vietnam involved, and my dad's generation, it was the Korean War. Every generation they have to give you a war to keep you scared, fearful, and to up the price of groceries and gas. Never mind 5G. What about 2G? I say gas and groceries. What's dividing us more than income levels? And so and so's on welfare or social assistance, and I got a good middle class thing going on. It's horrendous what we're doing to each other. And I see
and just to touch on that gas and groceries, I mean, that narrative, again, to go back to the N word narrative, is that we're being bombarded with, even that politician, and I won't mention names, but if anybody's paid attention to what I've said, they'll know who it is. That politician that you and I had the opportunity to speak with, talking about gas and groceries. When you brought that up, this politician who represents the Liberal Party, the party in power right now in Canada, says to us, well, it's Russia's fault. It's Russia's fault that gas and groceries are up. Never mind the fact that Canada is funding this war along with the US and some members of the EU. And, that billions and billions of dollars are going into this war. Lockheed Martin, I mean, do I need to say more? And it's Russia's fault that, okay. Make that one make sense. Riddle me that.
And again, you're right to bring it up, because again, if I want to stay with the broad strokes, because it is big picture stuff that is the threshold. And if you follow the money, as you just did for a moment, and see which governments are funding what, and how the governments, the American government largely has funded arms transference and logistics around the planet to foment smaller guerrilla conflicts and conflagrations.
Yeah, smaller or large scale.
Or larger. Yeah, larger. And again, what's behind it? But you could say, well, I mean, I'll say fundamentally that it's a violent mind state. Humanity, I mean, some writer said, I think it was Rousseau that said in some novel somewhere, I mean, the tendency toward violence in us runs deep, and it does. I mean, just go to a bar on a Friday night in Thunder Bay, and there's something's going to happen, maybe, eh? But the point is, on the larger scale, again, we have wars, and it's really horrendous. We don't get to see the actual carnage and the blood and guts part of it. That's pretty much kept from us. But they'll keep telling you that it's going on and it could happen here. And we kind of had a little bit of warfare on American soil when the Twin Towers came down. However you interpret that, whether you buy the narrative, which was it was a Middle Eastern terrorist attack upon America. Interestingly, they went right to Baghdad after that. But or if you think it was an inside job, it really ultimately doesn't matter if you agree with me or the narrative or the media narrative. Something horrendous happened and a lot of people died, and there was a lot of wasted materials. And here's a pragmatic point about war too, is aside from the obvious human carnage, we can't afford it environmentally anymore. We can't afford to take any more tanks and helicopters out of the earth.
Well, here's an interesting statistic. This is why the climate, climate
change.
I won't get right into it, but this is one of the reasons why the climate narrative is so frustrating, because, the same people that are sort of pushing these belief systems, the science behind this climate stuff, are the same people who are promoting, propagating, and probably profiting from the war machine. And so the US military industrial complex, this is the stat I was referring to, creates the equivalent of emissions, of carbon emissions and pollution, the equivalent of about 50 countries combined every year, every single year. And there's documentaries that have been done on this. The Empire Files looks into this. There's lots of information about this, and this is very much a mainstream, widely known statistic. So again, it's like the argument that we need war, or that, and you're right, it needs to end. I mean, whatever, we're preaching to the choir. These are useless words, but you're
maybe we are, maybe we aren't. And I wish you all the best with getting some purchase on this podcast. And again, I bow down to it. I listened carefully what you're saying there earlier. Promote, propagate, profit.
Mm-hmm.
There's a 3P teaching right there you just gave. Absolutely. So we're promoting certain things. And we propagate it, mm-hmm. and propagandize it, mm-hmm. and then we profit from it. Mm-hmm. So I grew up in the 60s, when one of the most horrendous news items that I remember as a child, seeing President Kennedy be assassinated on television. Mm-hmm. Everybody was shown it, and over and over and over, just like the Twin Towers, just like the submersible. As long as you keep bombarding the human senses with a message, the strongest amongst us, and I don't claim to be, we will fold under it and believe it. Absolutely. Right. Absolutely. So this is all I'm asking.
It's a couple of the, a few of the horsemen, which are fear and propaganda, fear and imagery, right? Consistent imagery and consistent fear. and we buy in. It's a buy-in. It's a, we're all in.
The Course in Miracles says, and this is such a profound sort of statement. You from the angelic or the creator's perspective, we continue to. This is a realm where we've decided to teach about fear and death and darkness. And from an actual total ethereal and spiritual standpoint, sort of looking down on it, if you will, it's very amusing because we are, as Conversations with God says, we are the magician who's been fooled by her own tricks. Mm-hmm. We pulled a rabbit out of the hat, and we believe that the hat and the rabbit both exist.
Mm-hmm. That's
so death itself. Yeah,
I love that, because that kind of ties into the idea that we are. It's true. That's true. We are magicians, right? And we truly are magicians. And we're
shapeshifters.
Well, absolutely. And we were put here with that magic and that ability to manifest, our thoughts, our dreams. We can do all of those things, and we surely do. I mean, but I think that's really part of the trick that, again, they pull with the narratives and the propaganda and all of that, is that there is an awareness that we are magicians, right? There is a knowledge of that is a gnosis that has been carried over time and it's ancient. It's an ancient knowing that we are magicians. Now, if they know that, then all they need to do is put the ideas out there. And they now, as you've mentioned earlier, we have this global information interchange which is the internet, and all the internet, news, TV, radio, whatever it is. All they need to do is place that imagery or that idea, and then, as you stated earlier, keep hammering us with it, and eventually that's going to be we will manifest it. The work is done. As soon as you put it out to, even if it's just a billion of us, what's the number, the magic number that you need to kind of quell
critical mass,
critical mass, or they did those experiments in, was it San Quentin prison, where there was a high level of violence, and then they got this group together and they did a meditation in there, and the violence levels went, there's that famous study that they did with the meditation, and all they needed to do was gather, a certain, I think it was 30 people out of, however many hundreds or thousands that are in San Quentin. I think it was San Quentin. And the violence just went down, right? It instantly, and it sustained for a time, right? And I think there's that, but I think it works the same way the other way too. You get people in a certain vibrational state, whether it's fear or anxiety or, ennui, a general sense of ennui, existential ennui, right? And they'll do the work for you. And that's,
this is, you're alluding again nicely to again an area that I would consider as truly revelatory, certainly for me, is the mental environment. Is that we are either easily manipulated or we are solidly not manipulated, centered. When I went for a walk in the mountains with Marshall Summers, the messenger of this material, he stopped with a small group of us and he pointed to a tree, and he said, "You see how the branches and the leaves are moving in the wind? Those aren't the students I'm looking for." And then he pointed to the trunk, which was steady and strong and rooted. Those are the students I'm looking for. You can't, that seed that the Creator has planted in us. These are the very times and the things that trouble me and you about the narrative and the state of the world. That's the very soil out of which that seed will germinate now. Because this is the timing is precise. You're not here by accident. None of us is here by accident in these times. and you've come to serve a very troubled and confused planet. And it's an opportunity. So it's an opportunity. So anything that's fearful within the new message about life in the universe and control in the mental environment and aliens amongst us, it's not a fearful thing. It's an opportunity. Because even some of the alien involvement, believe it if you may or not, can and could be very much influenced by our knowledge. And one of the greatest positive things in the new message is that humanity is still very emotionally and spiritually advanced. And this is the thing that you just mentioned is actually a threat to the narrative and to the corporate agenda, is that we are still, the fact that we have thriving religions on the planet is a problem for the forces of what are called the forces of dissonance.
Yeah. Well, and if anyone has any sort of questions about whether this is true or whether this is false, and I don't mean necessarily the content in the new message, you'll have to look through yourself, but
check it out yourself. Absolutely.
But I mean, I would just direct someone right away to what's called the gateway experience. This is the gateway. The gateway method is like, that's CIA level, high, military intelligence level, magic, superpowers that humans do have. And I mean, it sounds a little wacky, it sounds a little crazy, but this is this is tapping into the humans' natural ESP powers, astral projection abilities, they refer to some of it as remote viewing. There's tons of research done on this, and this is it, like tons, like there's schools that dedicate all of their research just to these, what we would essentially think of as Marvel superhero powers, but really some of them are really real, and humans
there's a great of truth in all those Marvel, and you look at too
the gateway experience, the gateway process. You can look into it, look it up. It's real. Cool. It's real.
Yeah, you look at why are there so many, why have we won't even touched on AI, but why are there so many robots and aliens in our children's cartoons and toys now? Yeah, that's just kind of could that be a basic?
Yeah, and I mean, I'll go all the way into that. And I mean, again, the critics will say, well, it's just because it's made up, and it's, but I think it's interesting. I mean, we could go really far into this. I mean, we could go all the way into cryptid land, but like, where did these ideas come from? Why are there hieroglyphs that have the depictions of men in starman suits, right? Like, why are there, hieroglyphs, petroglyphs, ancient drawings, ancient stories? Where did these ideas come from? Absolutely. And I mean, I guess the sort of the conspiracy minded, or the sort of creative minded would sort of go into like, well, let's look where that came from, and let's investigate, and let's see what people have to say, and let's what people have said in the past, and let's interview people who say that they've been abducted by aliens, or have seen things, or have had paranormal experiences, let's say, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we could do a whole podcast just on, and there are podcasts that are just dedicated to
tons,
right?
Tons.
Yeah.
I mean, the sightings of so-called UFOs since the 50s has done, if you graph that, it's done nothing but increase dramatically.
Yeah.
And lately, again, very recently in the news, Chinese weather balloons being shot down. Well, really, is a weather balloon that much of a threat to already threatened internet security?
Yeah.
So what is really being shot down?
Well, and then, it's interesting because like, simultaneously there's like stories coming out about like, it doesn't matter what country, but like foreign intelligence apparatus being allowed, to intercept our intelligence, and like all these, intelligence breaches and this and that, yet a balloon that sort of somehow flies into
right.
US or Canadian airspace or whatever, you have to, and then, yeah, it's all
Well,
quite.
again, go way back to the 80s when the war on drugs started.
Oh, geez.
And we've got, you and I can't get onto an air flight with a pair of nail clippers, a real terrorist weapon. And suddenly there are bales of cocaine arriving in North America from South American
Somehow.
Jungle laboratories somehow.
Yeah.
Okay, and you're going to tell me too, the great conspiracist, you're going to tell me, well, I mean, that this isn't somehow CIA.
No, absolutely.
You know,
And I mean,
the
because,
stuff is planted.
and really,
They plant it in, and then they create a war on it, right?
yeah. Well, and the war on drugs, I mean, for all their, social justice
Bravado.
policies, really,
Yeah.
me and you with a set of nail clippers, like, who gives a shit? But really, who it harmed was, marginalized, socioeconomically sort of
Fentanyl,
struggling
right?
people, largely
Right.
people of color, right? That's who it harmed. In this case, I mean, I think it was
Agenda 2030. We will eliminate poverty.
Yeah.
Well, how are they doing? First of all, yeah, that would be great if we did it in such a way that empowered people to have proper jobs and we had local food really in place. Yeah, I mean, nobody wants poverty.
That's not what's going to happen.
But how are we going to do it?
Eliminating poverty is a euphemism for you will own nothing. That's
Right.
what that means, right? The whole, like, you will own nothing and be happy. That's not just the slogan. It is a slogan. It is slogan, but it comes from a very serious and intentional place,
Right.
From on high, if you will, right?
And you talk about a gate, and thank you for that, the gateway experience, and pointing your listeners to that. And another gateway experience for people would be, of course, Agenda 2030.
Absolutely.
That you and I haven't even read the full document because, it's kind of a little too dark for me.
You know what? And the reality is, and I'm just going to say this, I've said this lots, and I try to say this sort of every time I talk publicly. Not that I talk publicly often, but if I talk publicly, I like to say it. Every single person on planet Earth, you don't need to read the full. I think the document itself is only about 40 pages. You don't even need to read the whole document. Just look at the highlights. You just look at the 17 tenets, right?
Right.
The last one, and it says right on it, is the most important one, is the public-private partnership, which is essentially the marriage of state and corporation, which is already happening to such a large extent. But then you bring the NGOs in, the intergovernmental organizations and the NGOs in, and you've got a full integration, full cooperation of state and non-governmental entities, being corporate and non-corporate, and they're running it. They're running the show, right? So there really is we've kind of lost the idea of free market and any sort of individual sovereignty. Like it's.
I believe in capitalism, essentially as a mechanism of healthy competition and inventiveness.
Fair enough.
But the bottom end of capitalism, of course, the underbelly is the destruction on the environment. But now capitalism has morphed into a kind of fascist corporatism.
There we go. That's it. And that's where it's going. So, and that's where, I would argue that that's where it has arrived, and it's just
Yes.
to get darker. But yeah, everyone on the planet should read the tenets of Agenda 2030, just to kind of get an idea of where we're headed and why certain policies and procedures are being implemented right now in the way that they are. Yeah, we haven't.
You'll see too, if I may, the insertion of that agenda, more or less wholesale, adopted into the city of Thunder Bay's cultural plan. Mm-hmm. It's inserted. Mm-hmm. So these large sort of global governance mechanisms and documents are being rolled out over the planet. Mm-hmm.
And largely sort of like right under our noses, like not.
And so how is that democratic?
Well, yeah. So one of those agendas is this World Health Organization pandemic treaty that's being ratified in, I think I'm going to say G20 nations. I think I'm right to say G20 nations. Like I could be corrected on that, and I'll correct my statement if I'm false. But Canada has signed on to this, and it didn't go through Parliament, so it hasn't been, I guess, formally ratified. If I'm using the terminology correctly, but it's been informally ratified. So one of the concerns and people might be like, well, who cares? Like, what does that have to do with? Now, why that's a concern is that when we enter in a state of emergency, which our leaders all over the world and, and oligarchs and the big business leaders tell us will absolutely happen. So more pandemics are coming, more disasters are coming. So they're promising essentially that these are going to happen. And so when we enter a state of emergency, when our governments decide that they're going to enact emergency measures, that's when these treaties come into effect, right? So they don't need to be, that's the thing, is they don't need to be formal law or formally legislated through Parliament and voted on in the formal process.
Well, because thank you for that. And because it's not a national thing anymore. We are struggling toward a global village. We are struggling toward a global community.
A unipolar world order, absolutely.
And
or multipolar, excuse me.
Multipolar. And the three things, to allude again for a moment to the teachings from the new message, the three things that humanity needs to get its act together on in regard to becoming a global community that could then be invited into or qualified to be part of the greater community in our solar system and beyond. The three requirements within the greater community are, according to these revelations, are unity, self-sufficiency, and discretion. And I'll flesh those out just for a moment. Unity should be self-explanatory, but might not be for people who hold sort of racist and sexist and political ideologies. Unity, we need to be truly unified as a human family. Self-sufficiency, we need to know how to feed and care for ourselves. We need to have energy and transportation systems that are sustainable. Currently, I don't believe that we have, although we're working on that. And then discretion. And the new message says repeatedly, we have to stop broadcasting. And I think I'm going to give you two examples of what I've struggled with figuring this out, because some of it isn't fleshed out necessarily. But broadcasting in the sense of humanity is very sloppy. Three things, actually. It lives on the surface of its planet. Most cultural planets with intelligent life in the universe on other planets have gone underground. And they've gone underground because of invasions and having destroyed their weather systems, which we're on the cusp of doing as well. So there's that aspect of broadcasting. We're just wide open, we're very sloppy, and broadcasting in the sense of, you remember that, was it the Viking thing that we sent out that had the universal man symbol on it, and it had samples of music and Bach and Beethoven, and it had some of our language. Well, that went floating out into space, and it's beyond our solar system now. Do you think that if there are, and there certainly are, if there are craft out there, they wouldn't have seen that and found us on its trajectory? And of course, the other thing about discretion and broadcasting is we've got the internet, and it is also wide open. And now, even within our own camps, we're concerned about who knows what about who. Instead of being at a stage where we are truly sharing our cultural information to then, wow, I mean, my mind goes too fast to keep up with it. I mean, I just saw an amazing piece that was posted through, I think it might have been my sister's Facebook thing that came through to me, but it's people might want to watch a movie called Anon, ANON, and it's the beginning of Anonymous. And it's really that in reality that this news item on Facebook was talking about. And this Asian person, and it had to come from an Asian person because they were calling out the Chinese government, said, this is coming to North America, probably already here. And it's people walking through a city and little squares and rectangles around their faces, facial identification, Facebook, and all the data on each one of those people.
Yeah, it's
Data.
facial recognition software in their CCTVs. I think there's something like again, I'll have to fact check this one, but or if anyone wants to fact check this, in China as a country, I think there are over 200 million or 2 million CCTV cameras,
right,
in China,
on
and
an average. Yeah, on an average downtown block in London, England, and this is a very conservative number. Mm-hmm. There are on any given, and some of these blocks are medieval age, right? There are an average of 1,000 cameras, and this is something that's troubled me, and I've ranted about it, for lack of a better word. You know, has anybody noticed all the cameras on the stores and on the traffic lights? And it's already here. So this is an outright denigration of human culture and an absolute invasion on privacy. For you, privacy is gone.
Yeah, it's surveillance state,
right?
And it's completely unilateral. Like there was no consent. There was no consent given. But this is a perfect example of when a state of emergency is implemented, certain infrastructure can be justified based on that. And then it's like, and then before you know it, it's already there. Right? I think, again, I want to shout out a number here. I think 3 million Canadians' personal data and cell phone records were
hacked and compromised, or
by the government, accessed by the government during the pandemic without consent, without being given. And to my knowledge, to date, there have not been any consequences for that. Again, the justification, I'm extrapolating here, but the justification being safety, security, health.
We're always told it's for our safety.
There have been no consequences. Nobody has been held to account. There are no checks and balances happening. And this is the concern when you get governments sort of taking liberties, not only taking liberties for themselves, but taking liberties away from sovereign citizens. I mean, there's a whole conversation to be had there. You know, are we sovereign citizens the moment we sell ourselves as a corporation to the state of Canada, to the Corporation of Canada, when we, you know, when our parents sign us up with a birth certificate? But that's a conversation for another day. I'd really like to touch on unity, self-sufficiency, and discretion.
Okay.
You know, and then back to that vortex piece of, you know, of course, unity, self-sufficiency, and discretion can be used in a positive way, in an uplifting way, in a way that's going to move us forward together, or it can be used as a weapon. Now, I'm going to touch on some of the ways that it's used as a weapon. Unity, you know, as being weaponized in sort of mainstream pop cultural media, government,
in the psychic environment.
It's is the constant, for the unity, for instance, it's the constant fracturing, fragmenting, and as we referred to earlier, separation of us from each other and our ideologies from each other, etc. self-sufficiency, well, I mean, we can see how more and more, especially in the pandemic, we saw how reliant we are on the system's offerings, not on our own, right? On our own sweat, blood, and tears, but on the systems. If there's no toilet paper available, shit's gonna hit the fan, right? But toilet paper is the least of our worries. That is not the those are not the big items. The big items are being able to survive, right? Fresh
But
water.
you see how basic the fear buttons are, because the first image they showed during the pandemic was people elbowing each other out of the way at Walmart for toilet paper.
Right.
And back to the hillbilly
Right.
planet, right?
And exactly. And on that note, like, self-sufficiency and survival, water and food, water at this point costs more than a Wi-Fi connection. You can go almost anywhere and get a Wi-Fi connection for free. And
Right.
and you can't go almost anywhere and get free water, right? Discretion is an interesting one too, because I think from the time we're born, we're literally taught the opposite. We're wholeheartedly buying into the propaganda narratives on a regular basis. And it's not only like, and it's not necessarily, I wouldn't blame people to a certain extent, because we've gotten to a point where you're actually vilified and ridiculed if you don't buy in whole hog to the propaganda narrative. You're labeled a conspiracy theorist. I think that in some circles still, I mean, believe it or not, I mean, I know you and I, it's just like, wow. But in some circles still, if you're not buying what the mainstream media is selling, you are a conspiracy theorist. And that is, as absolutely wild as that concept is, that is a reality in many, many schools of thought and circles still now today in 2023, in June 2023. So I appreciate, and I don't want to,
you and I really agree on that. That it's a common level-headed point to say that, isn't it interesting, as you and I have talked about, isn't it interesting that if you question the narrative, and there is, the latest, let's just call the narrative the latest news piece, especially the one that gets repeated over a period of time, if you question it or give some alternative explanation out of your own individual intelligence, you are immediately called mentally unstable, wacko, or conspiracy. Well,
you're a heretic. You're a heretic.
And again, look at so why are they so vehemently opposed to? So there's nothing democratic in that. And why is the narrative so important?
Well, and especially for somebody who claims to be a proponent of the scientific method or science in general. I mean, there's nothing critical thinking. There's nothing that sort of resembles critical thinking in that ideology of, not questioning the narrative. I mean, that was one of the most absurd sort of lines in the last few years, was that, if you question the narrative, somehow you're this conspiratorial heretic, instead of, just being critically minded and open to the fact that, science in its sort of essentialism is open to criticism and should be always open to criticism.
Should be, but there was a big disjunct and a wrinkle in that whole mechanism with regard to, the COVID pandemic.
It was an embarrassment. Frankly, it was an embarrassment to anyone who
was involved in science,
who was involved or who purported to be involved, and it was a joke. It's
still simmering though, isn't it, Jill? I notice people are masking more, and I still see people driving alone in cars with masks or outside.
The most shocking thing to me is healthcare professionals promoting. They should be the ones, promoting the science and health and then masking, or still even promoting healthy people.
And the signs on the lawns that say, "I support nurses." Well, wait a minute now. Of course I support nurses. They do hard work, but I mean, I also support the guy who flipped my burger. Why?
Yeah, but and also, because I support
sanity.
I support nurses, but like, Did you support the nurses who lost their jobs because they saw, you know,
through
that
it and
that
did
the
his
shot
best.
wasn't actually keeping people from getting COVID or helping people from getting sick? So, you know, in their 2 years of service during the pandemic on the front lines, you know, getting COVID possibly once or multiple times, and then coming out the other side only to be fired from their jobs for not undergoing a medical procedure that they saw firsthand didn't help people more than doing
And you
nothing.
and I know, at least a nurse locally, and we know several
Several.
who were in that. And the one that we know locally, of course, we won't mention her name, a fine, intelligent woman with a family total of 4, married with a couple of kids, lost a $500,000 house because of her stance and saying, no, I'm not taking the shot. I'm not masking. I'm not doing any of this.
Yeah, and we know several, and there are
Yeah,
thousands, if not hundreds
really
of
good people.
thousands around the country, right? And just this country, you know. Anyway, yeah, it's wild. It's unfathomable, really. I mean, the absolute preposterousness of this whole. Yeah, I'd really like to have you back on just to do just a COVID rant episode. I mean, maybe we should
Oh yeah.
keep that to ourselves and sort of do that on our own time, so to speak. But I'd really like, it's because you know what it is. It's not about having a rant or sort of pontificating, you know, and kind of stroking each other's egos. It's about the fact that these conversations need to be had, and
Yeah, and again, like I say sometimes on my radio show, when I was earlier on a number of years ago, I was younger and angrier, and I used to call them rants. And I said, but now it's kind of like I'm just settled into commentary. I just call it the old-fashioned term. Um,
yeah.
I just call it a commentary, but I do add the old. Isn't it interesting? It's a rant if you don't agree with it, and it's a commentary if you do.
Yeah, that's right.
But thanks for listening anyway.
I want to segue that into the misinformation, disinformation idea. So like, you know, when did it become misinformation or disinformation? And I like your little analysis of, you know, misinformation, MISS information, like you missed it. That's funny, but also, you know, it really reminds me of, you know, I think maybe even the Ministry of Information. I mean, it's very like dystopian, sort
It
of
is.
totalitarian, futuristic. It really is a totalitarian sort of trope, isn't it? Like
So
misinformation
so
and
many great so many great minds from George Orwell's 1984 to many other people predating him have predicted such dystopian scenarios where we are big brothers watching. And my little joke there, misinformation, was capital MISS information. It's a little gender jab at big sisters watching you.
right, right,
Misinformation. But anyway,
misinformation.
yeah, I mean, you can go anywhere with this. It's just that discernment is the ability to those of us who are proposing alternative narratives, we would like to see humanity become more unified and become more. It's really about. I don't like the term levels of consciousness, but when you do become interested in your own spiritual makeup, that we are triumvirate beings. We are mind, body, soul, mind, body, spirit. And when you do begin to feel yourself receiving information from other sources or source, it does change the way that you see the world. So, and I think that humanity would be wise to allow its spirituality to germinate, if I may put it that way.
Yeah, you really nailed it on so many things. And I mean, I appreciate your camaraderie. I appreciate
Mhm.
I appreciate that we found each other really in that, you know, universally tumultuous time of,
Right in the middle of the pandemic, we found each other actually, or
and
toward the beginning.
but you know, interestingly enough, I remember when you introduced me on the first episode of we did, where the first time you interviewed me on your show, you introduced me as an old friend, and it's true. I think maybe that was even almost like subconscious or something, because, but the truth is like, it feels like, you know, we've been doing this forever. So
there's
that's,
contiguity. Yeah.
yeah, you know, so
There's recognition.
there's, well, and there's, it really does feel like that we haven't just known each other for a year and a half. It feels like we've known each other for quite a lot longer, and
Fair enough. Yeah.
lots
Yeah.
of
It does too.
lots of converging, you know, perspectives. And yeah, and if I may just for a moment go back into the misinformation, disinformation stuff, I'd like to say, you know, I'd like to propose, I guess, that we all kind of, we abolish the notion of misinformation and disinformation. Because, you know, first of all, who gets to say what information is valid and what information isn't? We would have to establish sort of a universal truth first, and I don't think we're ever going to be able to do that. And yes, it is highly reminiscent of very concerning totalitarian impositions upon our thinking, the notion of information and knowledge production in itself. I think it threatens that. I think that the concepts of misinformation and disinformation, as, you know, decided or identified by, you know, let's say somebody that resembles a fact checker of sorts, you know, is just is the furthest thing from, you know, human beings being able to share ideas
Right.
and produce knowledge from it, right? So I think we should abolish those notions. And secondly, as I was kind of trying to allude to a few minutes ago, you know, the Ministry of Information in Britain, leading up to and during the Second World War, and I would add the Chamber of Culture in Germany, which was run by Goebbels, Joseph Goebbels, the notorious Nazi. You know, those were organizations and sections of government that really sort of encouraged the limiting of what they referred to as disinformation and misinformation, to the point that they created whole sections of government that were tasked to crush and snuff out what they perceived or what they identified as, you know, misinformation or anti-government, anti-war, you know, anybody who dissented, basically. And that's, you know, that's my fear. That's what it's turning into. I mean, I don't think the Ministry of Information in Britain ever subsided. You know, I would hazard a guess that it's still going. I'm sure we could find that out pretty easily, but I'm just going to throw it out there. It's probably, you know, under a different name, but still going. And I mean, maybe our sort of contemporary media is the manifestation of the sort of Ministry of Information type.
Yeah.
And in 1984, it was what? It was there's another word for it, 1984. I can't bring it to mind right now.
Big Brother.
Yeah, I mean, Big Brother, the thought police, whatever, we have it. We have this in various forms, but there is a ministry, the Ministry of
well, we even have the Ministry of Government Services now, but I've seen their trucks, their cars around.
Oh, we have the Ministry of everything.
You're onto a big one there, because I've been hearing, again, to keep it really current, which I think we try to be, is, you know, I do listen to CBC. You know, unfortunately, it's our only disseminator of whatever narrative, but again, they're owned outright by our government, and they are a corporate body. In fact, corpus, the corporation comes from corpus, Latin for body. So whatever that means, right? Body.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a rabbit hole, because what that means is, you know, legally, a person is legal fiction. The person is the corporation.
Yeah.
right? The corporate body, the corpus, the body of the human being is the corporation. And so
Right.
we're owned. And so this is, again, we're going into word magic, and, get out
Word
your
magic. Yeah.
your copy of the Black's Law Dictionary and look up the definitions of all these words under our legalese in Canada and,
And,
around the world.
and you have these young folks, both genders in the narrative, at the microphones of CBC, saying increasingly and on a daily basis, very recently, with great repetition, well, there's all these people disseminating misinformation, disinformation, and they come up with this a lot on our CBC national radio, and they and it always hits me somewhere almost bodily, in the wrong
In the
place. And I
corpus.
go, well, you have decided, you have decided, you have decided what the information is that I must consume and decide and agree with. Well, that really hits me. I mean, that always, I mean, there was even just a comedian that circulated a little meme-ish thing around the internet that said, this male comedian was saying, the whole pandemic thing, as a comedian, we comedians stood up and tried to make fun of it. But mostly the comedians were like poking fun or denigrating and pointing the finger at the ones who didn't buy the narrative, wouldn't vaccinate or mask, and talk down to them. And that was the source of humor. And he ends this little piece by saying, forgive me if I'm wrong on this, but I thought we were supposed to question authority. And
Yeah.
I've lived much of my life as I've kind of, even my own son says, yeah, keep your head down, hippie. It's rough out there, when he hears me go off, But I do see myself. I mean, for me, the original, I always say the original hippie radical was Christ, this long-haired guy in sandals that stood up to authority, and we know what happened to him. And when again, when they asked him to answer the charges, when he was in their clutches, and he turned himself in, and he predicted his outcome, because that's what makes him a prophet. But who profits from the prophets? I toss that one in there. He said, I don't answer to the charges, I answer to the Father. Whoa, like, what do you even do with that? That's the inner authority that needs to not only germinate, but become the tree of knowledge in all of us.
Yeah, and I mean, to add on a little bit to that, like I personally know people who have vacated charges by basically taking that same stance. No, I don't
I
understand.
don't recognize these laws.
I don't stand under you. I stand under God. Right. And, and for anyone that knows me, like, I'll go ahead and say, like, I'm not, I don't prescribe to any organized religion.
No,
I
no.
I
know that about you.
but
Yeah.
I honor all the sort of interpretations and manifestations of what the God essence and source.
Whatever it means to people. Yeah. And I'm not, I get forceful and opinionated about it, but I have no need as
Absolutely.
well.
But I respect and honor how you hold that in your heart, and you're always welcome to share, and express that in any way. I do want to touch on your commentary about, the CBC and them sort of really, again, propagandizing this notion of misinformation and disinformation. I mean, it's the Ministry of Information all over again, just it's being weaponized in a different way. We don't have a, although there is a war happening, or many wars happening around the world right now, we're not talking about it. We're fighting a different kind of war, right? It's not this propaganda isn't being weaponized against us in the same way as it was maybe in the 1930s or the 1920s, 30s. But it's being weaponized against us nevertheless, and it's the same horsemen of fear, anxiety, being sort of and repetition being sort of bombarded at us day after day, hour after hour, misinformation, disinformation. You're absolutely right to say, who are these people to to delineate which is which, and especially within the context of, and I'm going to bring up the National Citizens Inquiry. I'm going to list everything I've brought up that's of note in the show notes. If I can get around to dispersing this on some different platforms, I'll write some show notes, and I'll but there was this this thing called the National Citizens Inquiry that's wrapped up recently, that happened in Canada, that kind of investigated, if you will, what happened during the pandemic, and it went into the media, and there were journalists from the CBC that were interviewed, and they specifically identified incidents, multiple incidences where the CBC journalists knew what they were saying was false. They specifically vilified, ridiculed, and spread dissenting experts, first of all, and spread false information with regards to the science and the nature of what was happening during the pandemic, and did that knowingly. And by knowingly, I mean it was identified that they had the information prior to what happened. They went through with the falsehoods anyway, and simultaneously were calling people conspiracy theorists and purveyors of disinformation, while purveying and sort of, releasing false information. So it's a complete, you can't make this shit up, and it's a complete farce. And I wanted to mention to your comment about the comedians during that time. There were some comedians, very, very few, who were sort of trying to poke and sort of poke the bear, if you will, right? And all I remember thinking, like, where were Bill Hicks and George Carlin, where they would have been, and how they would have responded.
Well, Carlin, I'll tell you right now, Carlin would have been literally off the rails.
Off the rails. Here we go. Yeah. Off the rails. And I think Bill Hicks, to a certain extent as well, like, he was very, they were both very much on that sort of train of, I don't want to use the term truth, because I think truth can be really subjective, but they were really, they were open to questioning authority and exposing the sort of very obvious, overt mockings of I would say is like the system mocking the people, and really kind of roping us into some real unbelievable bullshit.
Well, the quantum leap of consciousness that was indeed, I believe, happening in the 60s, speaking up and speaking out, those were terms, speak up, speak out, and it was encouraged by that whole generation. They were tired of the white picket fence of the 50s they were growing up with, and the suburban mentality of get a job in a factory, and so they put the beads and flowers in their hair, and they tore down some of the gender and sexual barriers and so on,
and the race, the civil rights movement, right?
Yep. And not to romanticize it, because there were unwanted pregnancies, and there were psychotic breakdowns with the drugs, and there were things, but there was a spiritual movement. There was red power, there was black power, and black power was, let's be clear too, black power movement was different from Black Lives Matter.
Absolutely.
That's a whole other rabbit hole. Every child matters, Black Lives Matters. Those are more, I'm going to say it, those are more divisive than they purport to be.
Yeah. Well, they're actually creating more, for sure. Yeah. It's a whole rabbit hole.
That's another one. Yeah. But AI, misinformation, disinformation, and the sanctification of propaganda has become the commodification of consciousness. Data mining. They are commodifying something that
consciousness mining. You're codifying and commodifying.
Yeah,
and hijacking, right? Consciousness.
Chat GPT. Wow. Yeah. Wow. Even the guys who have developed, even the nerds and the dweebs and the scientists who have developed it, they're saying, well, wait a minute, I don't like where we're going with this.
It's Jurassic Park. It's Jurassic Park
Right.
all over again, right? It's like the dinosaur, the T-Rex has breached the fence, and now,
whoops,
now we're
whoops.
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, totally. Oh, totally.
Right.
It's,
So,
I mean, it's amusing in its predictability. And how we knew that this was going to happen all the way along. I mean, and you know, we can say, you know, life imitates art, or art imitates life, or
right.
predictive programming, or whatever. But, you know, really, I mean, we've seen what happens when Skynet sort of goes rogue. I mean, we've already seen it. So, right. Yeah, I mean, yeah, again, like, you really can't.
We love playing with fire. One of the things, to back to an earlier thing about unity, self-sufficiency, and discretion. When we began, and you know, in the discretion area, broadcasting, it's not in the conventional term. We're warned in the new message not to be broadcasting our every affairs. One of the things that brought in alien attention, literally, and craft, was when we began exploding nuclear and atomic bombs, and it literally caught some attention in the greater community, because it bubbled our atmosphere, and we know that now we have holes in our ozone, and it's like people's, well, how did that happen? Man's pollution? No, we
Aerosols,
blew
Lysol spray.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Blame it on the consumer. Yeah. So we literally blew holes in our atmosphere. We wonder why the planet's heating, and that we've got everything from weird alien pandemics and so on. But you know, we've got profound problems.
But instead of looking at the military industrial complex and putting credit where credit is due, we put it on, you know, our humans living their everyday lives. You know, not to say that we can't, you know, tweak some of our consumption and some of our,
right.
You know, of the stuff that we, you know, our impact. But and again, that's another whole topic for a whole show, you know, because there are environmental crises that are happening. It's just the story that they're selling us isn't the whole
hey,
story.
Jill, there are rabbit holes, and there are holy rabbits, eh?
That's exactly it.
We should be a little more holy.
But I think you know, I want to bring it back to the idea that you know, when we started exploding, you know, what they say was nuclear fission,
right,
bombs, which I'm not even convinced that that's what is happening. But the story they tell us is, you know, whatever, that it's nuclear fission. But what I find interesting, you mentioned it earlier, that there have been, you know, talking about explosion, there's been an explosion of sightings, you know, potentially, you know, unidentified flying craft sightings from that point until now. Now we could argue that, well, they're just more broadly and widely documented because of our ability to kind of, you know, take down people's experiences and spread them around, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, since the time that we started doing that, there was sort of an explosion or an increase, a market increase in.
Yeah, and we are literally playing around with, whether it be wireless communication or 5G towers, or chip implants. We're playing with fire, and what's just as important as at least observing our technology is observing our trajectory. Where have we landed? Okay, so I remember growing up in this town of Thunder Bay, which was then Port Arthur, Fort William, and things were cleaner. I mean, I don't want to be one of these old guys who romanticizes the past, and that's not what this is about. But I do remember a kinder, gentler community. And one thought I was thinking about yesterday when I was walking the dog, and a couple of young kids were kind of like walking on the other side of the road, and they looked over at me. They seemed to be looking at me suspiciously, and I'm just an old guy walking a dog, and they kept walking, and they kind of had sarcastic gestures, and you know what? And I went, hey guys, how you doing? and they responded the same. So it, and I thought, you know what? Why don't I just make the effort? Why am I always complaining inside about nobody says hello to each other anymore? Well, why am I on my high horse? So I did it, and
Unity.
I've done it. I've done it on numerous occasions, walking through a door, holding a door for somebody, and a quick little. And I got to tell you, I have these sort of emotionally intelligent moments where it just feels good. And instead of complaining about, people don't, so make an effort, say hello, right? But the point is, I had a moment with it where I thought, it's really becoming sort of disconcerting that people don't say hello to strangers a little more often. We've
Yeah, well,
become,
yeah, absolutely.
because the world really isn't, the local world, our world in general and the local world is not nearly as horrendous as media is trying to portray. And there isn't a child abductor in a van running around the city. It's rare. It's just so rare.
Yep.
So
I mean, well, so a few things. So there is what I thought of was like unity, and also what was really, I think, really, people don't look at each other anymore because they don't make eye contact as much. But I think a big part of that was when we started covering our faces, it changes our psychology. It changes the way we interact
does it ever?
together. It does. It absolutely does. And there's studies on this, and they're only going to increase. It decreases the humanity that you see in another person. It decreases that personalization. We have this thing that we do, this facial recognition software sort of embedded into our consciousness and our lovely brain.
We love to see a smile. We
like to recognize the face, but it's hard, right? It's harder to recognize a face from a distance when there is a you up close, you can see the eyes, and there are some facial expressions that can be conveyed through the eyes, but the absolute psychological impact of seeing everyone masked for the last 3 years, 2 years, whatever it is,
was huge.
Really impacted us. And then I wanted to mention, third thing, there aren't child abductors running around in vans anymore. But what is proliferating is human trafficking, right? And which is a very much a reality for many, and oftentimes, right, women of color are the most most vulnerable.
Yes, not to downplay some realities. Absolutely.
But you're right. Regardless, you're right. The risk is much lower than what the media would have us believe in terms of on all accounts, right? So, but then on those some other accounts like human trafficking, we have a curious dearth of reporting on this and a curious dearth of conversations around this. And there's some podcasts and there's some productions that have been done to kind of highlight the what's happening in certain communities, and and those have gone around, and good for those people for giving a voice to.
It was interesting for me the way my mind works. I would be quite easily called a conspiracist, and that's fine. You haven't gotten to know me, and even though, again, that word conspiracy, as we talked about, is so nuanced and it means so many things to so many different people, but at the beginning of the pandemic, when the masking was encouraged and in fact becoming mandated, I thought, well, this is interesting, because I'm concerned about all the cameras and Facebook and facial recognition. This is interesting. It kind of flies in the face, covering of that whole facial recognition thing. And then I instantly had another insight, I felt, which was, well, what they're doing is they're experimenting with their software facial recognition to the next level, which is just here.
Which is iris scanning, right?
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, absolutely.
So just before the pandemic, if I went in with this covered in a bank, it would have been
Take
call
it
for
off.
security.
Yeah, take it
But
off.
suddenly that's okay.
Yeah.
So, I mean, talk about off the rails, man. I do go off the rails, and I'm fine being off the rails.
Yeah, the crazy train has left the station, and yeah, it's, and I use like some people might not appreciate being called crazy, or but I embrace it like a badge of honor, because I do. I want to go off the rails. I want to explore sort of unpopular territory, and that's okay.
Good for you.
Yeah, that's okay with me. And and on that note, maybe we should call, I think it's been over 2 hours, so maybe we should call it, because who the fuck is going to listen to us for 2 hours? But maybe.
Well, you never know, Jill, and good for you for putting this together. And I was just going to say on that last comment of yours, the words, me being a philosophical background, even philology, which is the original meanings of words. The words weird and strange are related to the human soul or spirit, etymologically.
Yep.
You're weird.
And I'm a firm believer in word magic, and how,
absolutely, word power.
Power
Comes?
And intention, right? Intention and
awesome.
Yeah. And on that note,
thank you for this intention.
Yeah, much love. Thank you so much.
You too. Thanks, Jill.
And I hope you have a wonderful day. And I look forward to having you on again to have a discussion, maybe about something a little more sort of narrow.
Focused.
Yeah, focused.
Narrowed down. Yep.
Yeah, maybe COVID.
We did the broad strokes, Yeah. And we'll see you at the next rail sighting.
Awesome.
All right.
Have an awesome day, Scott.
Okay, Jillian.
Thanks so much.
You too. Blessings. Bye-bye.